The rain did not fall. It assaulted. Each drop was a shard of ice, driven by a wind that howled like a famished wolf across the skeletal landscape of the Badlands. It tore at the fine lace of her wedding dress, now a ruined tapestry of mud and desperation. The white silk, meant to signify purity and a new beginning, clung to her limbs like a sodden shroud, a mocking testament to the life she had just escaped. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath, a fire stoked by terror and exhaustion. Behind her, somewhere in the maelstrom of gray rock and churning sky, were the hunters. Their shouts, she imagined, were swallowed by the storm, but she felt their presence as a physical weight on her back, a cold certainty that propelled her forward when her muscles screamed for surrender. Alara did not know how long she had been running. Hours had bled into a seamless nightmare of slipping on slick clay and scrambling over jagged rock formations that rose from the earth like broken teeth. The world had been reduced to the pounding of her own heart, the shriek of the wind, and the relentless, punishing rain. Her bare feet were numb, cut and bruised by the unforgiving terrain, but the pain was a distant signal, a faint echo from a body she no longer felt was her own. She was merely a vessel for a single, primal instinct to flee, to put as much distance as possible between herself and Alistair Finch. The name itself was a venomous thing on her tongue, the memory of his possessive grip on her arm a fresh brand. He was not a husband. He was a collector, and she was to be his most prized, most beautiful acquisition, to be displayed and controlled. The hope of escape had been a fragile ember when she climbed from her window, and now, in the heart of this tempest, it was nearly extinguished. The Badlands were a place of endings, not beginnings. The land itself was hostile, scoured, and barren, offering no shelter, no solace. It was a mirror to her own desolation. She stumbled, her ankle twisting with a sickening crack of pain that finally broke through her exhausted numbness. A cry was torn from her throat, lost instantly to the wind. She lay in the ochre mud, the icy water seeping into the very marrow of her bones, and for a moment she gave in. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. It would be easier to simply lie here, to let the storm take her, to let the earth claim her before he could. It would be a kinder fate. But then a flicker. Through the driving sheets of rain, a light. It was faint, wavering, a single, defiant pinprick in the overwhelming dark. It was impossible, an apparition born of a desperate mind. Yet it remained, steady and yellow. It was a lamp in a window. It was civilization. It was a chance. That tiny spark of light ignited something within her, a reserve of strength she did not know she possessed. It was not hope, not yet. It was something harder, something more elemental, the will to endure. Gritting her teeth against the searing pain in her ankle, she dragged herself up. She used the rock face beside her for support, her torn fingernails scraping against the wet stone. Every movement was an agony, but the light pulled her onward. The light belonged to a town, if one could call it that. It was a handful of weathered, clapboard buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent wilderness. A single muddy track served as its main street. The place looked half-drowned, beaten into submission by the storm. But one building stood out, its purpose declared by a simple, painted sign swinging violently in the wind. Sheriff. The light was in its window. Law. Protection. The concepts felt alien, luxuries from a world she had left behind. But what other choice did she have? The sound of horses, distant but distinct, cut through the gale. They were closing in. Her pursuers were relentless. Panic seized her again, sharp and suffocating. She half-limped, half-ran the last few yards, her ruined dress trailing behind her like a broken wing. The wooden steps to the sheriff's office were slick with rain. She clawed her way up them, her hands shaking too violently to work the doorknob at first. With a final, desperate sob, she twisted it open and fell inside, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards in a heap of mud, silk, and trembling fear. The door slammed shut behind her, a final, percussive note in the symphony of the storm. The warm, dry air of the room, smelling of wood smoke and old paper, enveloped her. A tall, broad-shouldered figure rose from a chair behind a desk, his face cast in the shadows thrown by the single oil lamp. She could not see his expression, only his silhouette against the light. She tried to speak, to explain, to plead, but all that came out was a choked whisper, a prayer offered up to the darkness. "Help me." Then the world, which had been a blur of gray and pain, finally dissolved into blackness. She awoke to the quiet hiss of a wood stove and the unfamiliar sensation of warmth. For a moment, she was adrift, untethered from the terror of the flight. Then memory returned with the force of a physical blow, and she sat up with a gasp, her eyes wide with fear. She was not on the floor. She was lying on a narrow cot in a jail cell. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic through her. The bars were cold, solid iron. She was trapped. Again, but this was different. The cell was clean, the gray wool blanket covering her was coarse but warm, and a tin cup of water sat on a small stool beside the cot. A pair of men's trousers and a simple flannel shirt were folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The gesture was so startlingly practical, so devoid of menace, that it disarmed her fear, replacing it with a profound confusion. The man from the desk sat in his chair, watching her. He hadn't moved, it seemed, though the lamp on his desk had been refilled, its glow now stronger against the deep twilight pressing at the windows. He was large, but he occupied his space with a stillness that was not threatening, merely present. His face, now visible in the light, was all harsh angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they held an unnerving neutrality. He wasn't looking at her as Finch would have, with a predator's appraisal, but with a quiet, steady observation, as if she were a puzzle he was patiently trying to solve. He wore a simple shirt, suspenders, and a tarnished star pin to his vest. "The sheriff." "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. It was not unkind, but it offered no easy comfort. Alara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her body still trembling from a chill that was more than physical. She looked from his impassive face to the iron bars separating them. "Why am I in here?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Safest place for you," he replied, without inflection. "The door locks from the outside. No one comes in unless I allow it." The simple logic of his statement settled over her. The cell was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. The bars were not to keep her in, but to keep others out. She looked down at the torn, mud-caked remnants of her wedding dress, which lay in a heap in the corner where someone had placed it. The sight of it made her stomach clench. It was a symbol of her bondage, and she was grateful for the plain, worn clothes he had left for her. Slowly, stiffly, she rose and began to change, turning her back to him for a sliver of privacy. The dry fabric was a profound relief against her cold skin. The trousers were too long, the shirt too broad, but they felt like armor. When she turned back, he was still watching. He had not moved. He seemed to possess an inexhaustible capacity for stillness. "They'll be looking for me," she said, the words barely a whisper. "My husband," she choked on the word, the lie of it bitter in her mouth. "Alastair Finch." The sheriff's expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, perhaps. The name Finch carried weight, even out here in the desolate fringes of the world. It meant money, power, and the kind of influence that could sweep away a small-town sheriff like driftwood in a flood. "He will not stop," she continued, her voice gaining a desperate urgency. "He believes he owns me. He will tear this town apart to find me. You have to help me." She moved to the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. The plea that had been forming in her heart since she saw the light in his window finally spilled out. "Hide my tracks, Sheriff. Please, lie for me. Say you never saw me. Say the storm washed me away." He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the cell. He was taller than she had realized, his shadow stretching long and dark across the room. He stopped just on the other side of the bars, close enough that she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes. He smelled of rain and leather. He did not answer her plea directly. Instead, he looked at her feet, which were now clean, though bruised and cut. He had tended to them while she was unconscious. The thought sent a strange, unsettling warmth through her. It was a kindness so unexpected it felt like a trick. "Tracks turn to mud in a storm like this," he said, his voice still low and even. "Most of them are gone already." He met her gaze, and his gray eyes were serious, holding no false promises. "The rest we'll see." It was not the assurance she craved, not the vow of protection she had prayed for, but it was not a refusal either. It was a careful, measured statement of fact, an acknowledgement of her request. He slid a heavy iron key into the lock of the cell door, but he did not turn it. He simply left it there. Then he walked to the stove, picked up a tin plate of beans and salted pork that had been warming there, and brought it to her, sliding it through the small gap in the bars. He said nothing more. He returned to his desk, picked up a ledger, and began to write, the scratching of his pen the only sound besides the storm and the crackle of the fire. Alara stood there for a long moment, the plate warm in her trembling hands. He had not promised to hide her, but he had given her shelter, clothes, and food. He had locked her in to keep the world out and left the key in the door as a silent symbol of, what? A choice? A possibility? She didn't know. But as she began to eat, the simple, nourishing food chasing away the deep, gnawing cold, a fragile seed of trust, as small and stubborn as the light in the window, began to take root in the barren soil of her fear. The storm did not abate. For 2 days, it held the small, nameless town in its grip, isolating it completely from the outside world. The wind shrieked a constant, mournful dirge around the corners of the sheriff's office, and the rain fell in a relentless, gray curtain, turning the single street into a river of mud. For Alara, the world shrank to the dimensions of her cell, the adjoining office, and the stoic presence of the man who moved within it. His name, she learned from a faded warrant tacked to the wall, was Silas Blackwood. The name suited him. It was as solid and unyielding as the man himself. Her cell, which had at first felt like a cage, slowly transformed in her perception. It became a haven, a fortress. The iron bars were a comfort, a tangible barrier between her and the unnamed horrors that hunted her. From this small, protected space, she watched him. His routine was simple, deliberate. He rose before dawn, stoked the fire in the wood stove, and made coffee that filled the office with a rich, bitter aroma. He would check the door, stare out at the deluge for a long moment, and then settle at his desk with a stack of paperwork that seemed to be in a perpetual state of disarray. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that was reassuring. There was no wasted energy, no anxious fidgeting. He was a man rooted to his purpose, whatever that might be. He rarely spoke. Their interactions were marked by a profound and strangely comfortable silence. In the morning, he would slide a cup of coffee and a piece of hardtack through the bars. At midday, a plate of whatever he was eating, usually beans, salted meat, or a thick stew he cooked on the stove. He never asked her questions about her past, about Alistair Finch, about the torn wedding dress he had quietly bundled and burned in the stove on the first morning. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the storm, as a fact of nature to be dealt with, not questioned. This absence of prying was the greatest kindness he could have shown her. It allowed her the space to breathe, to let the frantic terror in her heart subside into a dull, manageable ache. On the second day, she found a needle and a spool of dark thread in a small tin box on the shelf in her cell, tucked away with a bar of soap and a worn comb. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He merely glanced up from his ledger and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod before returning to his work. She took the ruined dress from the corner. The fine silk was beyond true repair, but she began to stitch the largest tiers, her fingers moving with a practiced rhythm she'd learned as a girl. The act was meditative. Each stitch was an act of defiance, a small reclamation of a life that had been so violently torn apart. She was not mending the dress to wear it again. She was mending herself, piecing together the frayed edges of her own spirit. As she worked, she felt his eyes on her occasionally, his gaze thoughtful, observational, before returning to his papers. She learned about him in fragments, through the small details of his existence. He had a stack of worn books on a shelf behind his desk. Shakespeare, Marcus Aurelius, tales of Greek mythology. It was a surprising collection for a lawman on the edge of nowhere. It spoke of a mind that sought something beyond the grim realities of his profession. He was respected by the few townspeople who braved the storm to see him, but not loved. A blacksmith came to report a dispute over a lame horse. A gaunt woman from the general store asked for credit. They spoke to Sheriff Blackwood with a deference that bordered on fear. He listened patiently, his judgments swift and fair, but his demeanor kept them at a distance. Like her, she realized he was an outsider. He did not belong here, not really. He was simply passing through, or, perhaps, had ended up here as a final destination. That evening, as the light outside faded into an impenetrable gloom, he rose from his desk and walked not to the stove, but to the bookshelf. He selected a thin, leather-bound volume and brought it to her cell. He slid it through the bars without a word. It was a collection of poems. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. His hand was calloused and warm. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, a startling reminder of human connection in her profound isolation. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded again, that same small, economical gesture, and returned to his desk. She sat on her cot, the book open in her lap, the lamplight falling on the printed words. She did not read them. Instead, she watched him. He was not writing now. He was cleaning his revolver, his large hands surprisingly deft as he disassembled the weapon, oiled each part with meticulous care, and reassembled it with a series of satisfying clicks. The methodical, focused action was mesmerizing. This was a man who understood the mechanics of violence, who lived with it as a constant companion. Yet he had shown her nothing but a quiet, restrained decency. He had given her shelter from a storm, both literal and metaphorical. He had asked for nothing in return. He had not offered empty words of comfort, but he had given her coffee and thread and poetry. In the silent, watchful space between them, something was being forged. It was not friendship, not yet. It was a fragile, unspoken alliance, a recognition of a shared solitude. She felt her fear of him, the initial terror of being caged by a stranger, slowly, almost imperceptibly, dissolving. It was replaced by a tentative, burgeoning trust, as precarious and as precious as a candle flame in a drafty room. The rain stopped just before dawn on the third day. The silence that descended was more jarring than the storm's fury had been. It was a heavy, listening silence, thick with anticipation. Alara woke to it, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. When Silas opened the office door, the air that drifted and was cool and clean, washed new by the deluge. But with the clear air came the certainty that her time of sanctuary was over. The roads would soon be passable, and Alistair would come. It was mid-morning when she heard them, the rhythmic squelch of hooves in the deep mud, a sound that grew steadily from a distant pulse to an immediate, terrifying presence. She scrambled to the small, barred window at the back of her cell, which offered a slivered view of the main street. For riders were making their way into town. They moved with an arrogant assurance, their fine horses and expensive gear a stark contrast to the dilapidated surroundings. The man in the lead, even from a distance, was unmistakable. Alistair Finch. He sat his horse as if it were a throne, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence in his own power. He wore a tailored riding coat that had somehow remained immaculate, a testament to the wealth that insulated him from the world's discomforts. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in Alara's stomach. Her breath caught in her throat, and the half-mended dress slipped from her numb fingers. All the progress she had made, the fragile sense of safety she had built within these walls, crumbled to dust. He was here. The monster from her past had found his way to her present. Silas had heard them too. He had risen from his desk, and was standing by the front window, his silhouette a dark, immovable shape against the pale morning light. He watched them ride the length of the street, his body perfectly still, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his holstered pistol. He showed no sign of alarm, no flicker of surprise. He simply watched and waited, a bulwark of calm against the approaching threat. Finch and his men dismounted in front of the saloon, their voices carrying easily in the still air. Alistair gave instructions in a tone accustomed to immediate obedience. Two of his men, rough-looking individuals with the casual brutality of hired muscle, began a methodical canvass of the town, starting with the livery stable. Alistair and the fourth man strode into the saloon. Alara knew his strategy. He would buy information, charm, and intimidate in equal measure until he found what he was looking for. He would treat the town and its people as his personal property, just as he had intended to treat her. She backed away from the window, pressing herself into the far corner of the cell, trying to make herself small, invisible. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might break free. This was it. The waiting was over. She looked at Silas's broad back, at the tarnished star on his vest. He was just one man. Alistair had money, influence, and 3 men who were clearly armed and willing to do his bidding. The odds were impossible. She had led this danger to his doorstep. Guilt warred with her terror. She should have kept running, should have perished in the Badlands rather than bring this upon him. The saloon doors swung open again. Alistair emerged, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a look of predatory amusement on his handsome face. Someone inside had clearly talked. His eyes scanned the remaining buildings, lingering on the general store, the blacksmith, and finally, inevitably, settling on the sheriff's office. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his lips. He had found her. He tossed the rest of his drink into the mud and started walking toward them, his boots making sucking sounds in the thick street. His 2 men, having found nothing elsewhere, now flanked him, their hands hovering near their own pistols. Silas turned from the window. He didn't look at Alara. His gaze was fixed on the front door. He walked to the heavy oak beam that served as a crossbar and lifted it from its brackets, letting it rest on the floor. He was unbarring the door, inviting them in. Alara's blood ran cold. Was he giving up? Was he going to hand her over? The fragile trust she had placed in him fractured. He was a lawman, and Alistair Finch was a powerful man who could make a small-town sheriff's life very difficult, or very short. Perhaps he had only been offering temporary shelter, a brief respite before the inevitable. The heavy tread of boots sounded on the wooden porch. The doorknob turned. Alistair Finch stepped into the room, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and cold menace. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene, the sparse office, the stoic sheriff behind the desk, and finally, Alara huddled in the corner of the cell. His smile widened. It was a victor's smile, full of possession and contempt. Well, Alistair said, his voice a silken drawl that did nothing to hide its underlying cruelty. Sheriff, it seems you found my missing property. I'll be taking her back now. Silas did not move from behind his desk. He looked at Finch, his gray eyes as flat and hard as river stones. She's not property, he said, his voice quiet, yet it filled the room, a low rumble of absolute authority. And she's not going anywhere. The air in the office crackled with a sudden, violent tension. Alistair's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. His men shifted their weight, their hands dropping to their guns. The standoff had begun. Silas had not abandoned her. He had unbarred the door not as an act of surrender, but as a challenge. He was meeting the threat head-on, in his own space, on his own terms. And as Alara watched him, a single man standing resolute against the power and cruelty that had almost destroyed her, the terror in her heart did not vanish. But for the first time, it was joined by a flicker of something else entirely, a defiant, desperate hope. Alistair Finch let out a soft, condescending laugh. It was a sound designed to belittle, to assert dominance. "Sheriff," he began, taking a step further into the room, his men fanning out slightly behind him, "I believe you misunderstand the situation. That woman, He gestured dismissively toward the cell with his riding crop. "Is Alara Croft. My fiancée. We were to be married 2 days ago. She suffered a bout of hysteria, a woman's panic, and fled. I have come to retrieve her, for her own good." He looked at Silas, his eyes glittering with malice disguised as concern. "I'm sure a man in your position understands the delicate nature of such matters. It is a private, family affair." Silas remained seated, his hands resting flat on the surface of his desk. He did not look at Alara. His entire focus was on Finch. "What I understand, Mr. Finch," Silas said, his voice still unervingly calm, "is that a woman came to my office seeking sanctuary during a storm. She appears to be in distress. The law requires me to ensure her safety and well-being." "Her safety?" Finch scoffed, his arrogance swelling. "Her safety is with me, her future husband. I have the finest doctors. I can provide for her every need." "What can you provide?" "A cage and stale water." He took another step, his polished boots gleaming even in the dim light of the office. He was now only a few feet from the desk. "I have a marriage license, signed and sealed. I have witnesses." "What do you have, Sheriff?" "A runaway hysteric and a misplaced sense of duty." "I have jurisdiction," Silas replied, the two words landing with the weight of stones. "And until I am satisfied that she is not in danger and is willing to leave of her own accord, she will remain here, under my protection." The threat was unspoken, but clear. To take her, Finch would have to go through him. Finch's eyes narrowed. He was a man accustomed to buying or bullying his way to what he wanted. He was not used to being told no, especially not by a lawman in a town that barely registered on a map. He glanced around the office, his lip curling in contempt. "Your protection? In this hovel? Do you even know who I am? My family has holdings from here to the capital. I can have this town erased. I can have your badge stripped from you before sunset." "You can try," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a dangerous whisper. "But while you're sending your telegrams and calling on your powerful friends, she'll be here. And so will I." It was a stalemate, a battle of immovable will against irresistible force. Alara watched from the cell, her hands gripping the bars so tightly her knuckles were white. She could feel the violence simmering just beneath the surface of the conversation. Finch's men were coiled springs, their eyes darting between Silas and their employer, waiting for the signal. But Finch was too smart for a simple, brutish attack. A shootout with a sheriff in his own office would create complications, paperwork, questions that even his money might not be able to silence completely. He preferred to win without getting his own hands dirty. He changed tactics, his voice softening into a mask of reason. "Sheriff, let's be practical. There is no need for this unpleasantness. I am a wealthy man. I am sure I can make a contribution to this fine community, a new school, perhaps, or a personal donation, to compensate you for your time and trouble." He was trying to buy him, assuming, as he always did, that every man had a price. Silas slowly stood up. He was taller than Finch, broader. He did not loom or threaten, but his sheer physical presence shifted the balance of power in the room. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Finch," he said. "This is the law. Now, I suggest you and your men find rooms at the hotel. You're welcome to wait, but you will not set foot in this office again without my invitation." He moved from behind the desk, walking not towards Finch, but towards the door, his intention clear. He was dismissing him. The insult was profound. Finch's face, usually a mask of handsome control, contorted with rage. For a moment, Alara was certain he would give the order, that the room would erupt in gunfire. One of Finch's men took a half-step forward, his hand clenching around the handle of his pistol. Silas stopped, his body angled slightly, his own hand now hovering inches from his sidearm. The room grew so quiet that Alara could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. The moment stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. But Finch, with a visible effort, regained his composure. He would not be goaded into a foolish mistake. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head to his man. "Very well, Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "We will wait. But do not mistake my patience for weakness. You have made a powerful enemy today. You will come to regret it." He turned on his heel and stalked out of the office, his men following close behind, like wolves trailing their master. Silas watched them go, his expression unreadable. He stood at the open door for a long time, watching as Finch and his men crossed the muddy street and disappeared into the saloon. Only when they were gone did he turn and close the door, this time sliding the heavy oak beam back into its brackets, sealing them inside. He walked back to his desk and sat down, the tension slowly ebbing from his shoulders. He picked up his pen as if nothing had happened, but Alara could see that his hand was not quite steady. He had won the first battle, a confrontation of pure will, but they both knew the war was far from over. Finch was not a man to accept defeat. He would wait, and he would plot. The small sheriff's office was now a fortress under siege. The tension that had filled the office during the confrontation did not dissipate after Finch left. It seeped out into the town, changing its very atmosphere. The siege was no longer a matter of direct threats, but a slow, insidious poisoning of the community. From her window, Alara watched as the town, which had seemed merely weathered and weary, began to show its fault lines. Finch and his men had taken up residence in the saloon, and it quickly became their seat of power. They were a constant, menacing presence, a stark reminder of the world of wealth and influence that lay just beyond the Badlands. Alara was no longer just a fugitive. She was a spectacle, a source of gossip and speculation. She saw the townspeople, the blacksmith, the storekeeper's wife, the few rough-looking prospectors who drifted in and out, glanced toward the sheriff's office with a new kind of curiosity, one tinged with suspicion and fear. Finch was buying rounds of drinks, his voice carrying from the saloon's open doors, spinning a narrative. She couldn't hear the exact words, but she could imagine them. He would be painting her as a fragile, damaged creature, mentally unstable, and portraying himself as the devoted, heartbroken man trying only to save her from herself. He would paint Silas Blackwood as a stubborn, foolish obstacle to this noble cause. Money talked, and Finch's money was shouting. The silence in the office felt heavier now. Silas was more watchful, more tense. He spent long periods standing at the window, not looking at the saloon directly, but observing the subtle shifts in the town's daily rhythm. He knew what Finch was doing. He was isolating them, turning public opinion into a weapon. That evening, Silas brought her a plate of food. It was the same simple fare as before, but the ritual had changed. The air was charged with unspoken anxieties. As she took the plate, her courage, which had been a flickering candle, suddenly burned brighter, fueled by a simmering anger. She was tired of being a passive victim, a trembling creature in a cage. She was tired of Alistair writing her story for her. "He will tell them I am mad," she said, her voice clear and steady, breaking the long silence. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation about her situation. Silas stopped, turning back to face her. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and seemed to recognize the change. The desperate fear in her eyes had been replaced by a hard, defiant light. "It's what men like him do," he said simply. "They break things, then call them broken." The truth of his words resonated deep within her. He understood. He saw past the torn dress and the wild-eyed terror of her arrival. He saw her. This realization emboldened her further. She had to make him understand the full truth, not for pity, but for the sake of the alliance that was forming between them. "It was not a woman's panic," she said, her voice low but intense. "It was not hysteria. My father's business was failing. He made a deal with the Finches. He sold me. That is the truth of it. The night before the wedding, Alistair came to my room. He wanted to claim his property early. He showed me a collar he had made for me, a silver thing with a lock. He said it would be my wedding gift. He said it would remind me who I belonged to." She paused, the memory making her feel cold despite the warmth of the stove. "When I refused him, he struck me. He said I would learn obedience. I knew then that marrying him would not be a life. It would be a different kind of cage, one I would never escape. So I ran." She had not intended to say so much, but the words poured out, a confession and a declaration. She was not a madwoman. She was a survivor. She met his gaze without flinching, letting him see the unvarnished truth of her desperation. Silas listened without interruption, his face a granite mask. But his gray eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, colder. It was a shared understanding of the world's casual cruelty. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the office, and took something out. He came back to the cell and placed a heavy, dark object on the small shelf just inside the bars. It was a pistol, a Colt Peacemaker, its metal worn smooth with use. It was smaller than his own, but no less deadly. "Do you know how to use one?" he asked, his voice flat. Alara looked at the gun, at its grim promise of power and finality. Her father, before his fortunes had turned, had believed a daughter living on the frontier should be able to protect herself. He had taken her shooting on Sundays, a secret they kept from her mother. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My father taught me." "Good," Silas said. He pushed a small, heavy box of cartridges onto the shelf beside it. "It's loaded. Keep it out of sight. It's just in case. Just in case." The words hung in the air between them. In case he failed. In case Finch's men stormed the office. In case she was the last line of defense for her own life. It was a terrifying responsibility, but it was also a profound gift. He was not just protecting her, he was arming her. He was acknowledging her right to fight for herself. The weight of the gun was a terrible burden, but it was also an anchor. It was a solid, tangible piece of her own agency. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He gave his characteristic short nod. "Get some rest," he said, and turned away, leaving her alone with the weapon. She picked it up. The metal was cool and heavy in her hand. It felt alien and yet horribly familiar. She checked the cylinder, the movements coming back to her as if by instinct. It was fully loaded. She held it in her lap for a long time, the weight of it a strange and bitter comfort. Alastair Finch thought she was a fragile, hysterical thing to be owned and controlled. Sheriff Blackwood had just given her the power to answer that assumption with a bullet. Her fear was still a living thing inside her, but now, for the first time, it had a companion, a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just the hunted. She was armed. The next day, the town's judgment began to fall in earnest. Alastair Finch, having failed to intimidate the sheriff, now sought to undermine him. He played the part of the magnanimous gentleman wronged, a performance for the small, captive audience of the town. He paid the blacksmith triple the usual rate to reshoe his horses, leaving the coins on the anvil with a grand flourish. He bought out the general store's entire supply of whiskey and had it delivered to the saloon, declaring free drinks for any man who would share his company. He was buying loyalty, or at least the appearance of it. From her window, Alara watched the poison spread. She saw the blacksmith, a man who had spoken to Silas with grudging respect just days before, now avert his eyes when he passed the sheriff's office. She saw men who usually spent their days prospecting or mending fences now loitering on the saloon's porch, drinking Finch's liquor and laughing at his stories. Their laughter was a harsh, grating sound that set her teeth on edge. The whispers started, carried on the wind like bitter seeds. She heard them when the storekeeper's wife came to sweep the porch next door. Says she's not right in the head. Plumb crazy. Thinks the sheriff is some kind of hero, but he's just abetting a mad woman. Alara shrank back from the window, the words striking her like stones. They were not just talking about her. They were erasing her. They were accepting Finch's version of the truth because it was easier, more entertaining, and came with free whiskey. Her isolation, once a source of safety in the cell, now felt suffocating. The town was no longer a neutral backdrop. It was a hostile force, its collective gaze a heavy weight. She was the outsider, the problem, the disruption to their quiet, hardscrabble lives. And Silas, by protecting her, had marked himself as an outsider too. She saw the shift in how people treated him. When he walked down the street to the well to fetch water, the path cleared before him. Men on the saloon porch fell silent. watching him with a mixture of fear and derision. They saw him not as the law, but as an obstacle to the generosity of the rich man in their midst. The societal pressure was a more insidious threat than Finch's direct confrontation. It was a slow strangulation designed to wear Silas down, to make his position untenable. Alara felt a surge of helpless fury. She was the cause of this, the sickness that had infected this small community. Inside the office, Silas seemed impervious to it all. He went about his duties with the same stoic calm, but Alara could see the subtle signs of strain. He cleaned his firearms more often. He spent less time at his desk and more time watching the street. He was a sentry on the wall of a fortress whose own citizens were beginning to sympathize with the enemy at the gates. That afternoon, he left the office for a short while. It was the first time he had left her completely alone since her arrival. He locked the main office door from the outside, a precaution that made her stomach clench. He was going to the livery, he said, to check on his horse. It was a necessary task, but his absence left the office feeling vast and empty. The silence was no longer companionable. It was menacing. She was acutely aware of the pistol, hidden under the thin mattress of her cot. While he was gone, she took it out. She needed to reacquaint herself with it, to make its weight and balance a part of her. She stood in the center of the small cell, adopting the stance her father had taught her. She raised the weapon, her arm trembling slightly, and aimed at a knot in the wooden wall. She practiced her breathing, just as he had shown her. A slow inhale, a steady hold, a controlled exhale. She imagined the kick of the recoil, the deafening report. She dry-fired the weapon, the click of the hammer falling on an empty chamber, sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. She did this again and again, until the trembling in her arm subsided, until the pistol felt less like a foreign object and more like an extension of her will. The act was grounding. It was something she could control in a situation that was spiraling far beyond her control. She was not just a victim waiting to be rescued or condemned. She was a woman with a weapon, practicing, preparing. The whispers outside could call her mad, but in here, holding the cold, hard reality of the Colt, she felt a sliver of sanity. It was the sanity of survival. When Silas returned, she had the pistol hidden away again. He gave no sign that he knew what she had been doing, but as he slid the heavy bar back across the door, he met her eyes for a moment. His gaze was steady, assessing. In it, she saw not suspicion, but a kind of grim approval. He knew that the time for hiding and waiting was coming to an end. The town had made its judgment. Finch was growing more confident, more impatient. Soon, he would make another move. And when he did, they would both have to be ready. The world outside the office had turned against them, but within its walls, their silent, desperate alliance had been forged into something as hard and as real as the steel of the gun she kept hidden in the dark. The sun set, painting the bruised-looking clouds in shades of orange and violet. The spectacle of beauty was a cruel irony against the ugliness brewing in the town. As dusk settled, Silas lit the lamp, and the familiar, small world of the office was re-established against the growing darkness. He did not settle at his desk, as he usually did. Instead, he pulled a chair from the corner and placed it in front of her cell, sitting down to face her directly. It was a deliberate change in their routine, a signal that the time for silent observation was over. "He's losing patience," Silas said, his voice low. "His money has bought him friends, but it hasn't bought him what he came for. A man like Finch can't stand being denied. He'll force the issue soon, tonight or tomorrow." Alara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had felt it too, a gathering of energy, a tightening of the spring. "What will he do?" "He'll try to create a pretext," Silas explained, his eyes fixed on her, gauging her reaction. "He'll get some of the men he's been feeding liquor to drunk enough to form a mob. They'll call themselves a concerned citizens posse, wanting to rescue the poor, mad woman from the stubborn sheriff. It'll be just enough cover for his own men to do the real work. It will get bloody." The scenario he painted was terrifyingly plausible. A chaotic, violent eruption that would give Finch the plausible deniability he needed. "And you?" she asked. You cannot fight them all. No, he agreed, without a trace of self-pity. I can't, which is why waiting here for it to happen is no longer an option. We can't win a siege, so you have to leave. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Leave? Go back out into the wilderness alone? The thought was terrifying. The office had become her entire world, a bastion of safety. But she saw the hard logic in his eyes. Staying was a death sentence for both of them. He will be watching the roads, she said, her mind racing. His men will be everywhere. They'll be watching the main roads, Silas corrected. The easy ways out. They won't be watching the old trails through the canyons. It's a hard ride, dangerous, but it will take you north toward the rail line at Silver Creek. Finch won't think you have the stomach for it. He won't think I'd send you that way alone. It was not a rescue mission. He was not leading her to safety. He was giving her a map, a direction, and a chance. The success or failure of it would rest entirely on her. It was a daunting prospect, but it was also a profound show of faith. He believed she could do it. He stood and walked to his desk, retrieving a folded, hand-drawn map from a drawer, along with a small, leather-bound compass. He brought them to her, along with a canvas satchel. My horse is already saddled and waiting in the old, abandoned smithy behind the general store. Her name is Shadow. She knows the terrain. In this satchel, there's jerky, hardtack, and a full canteen. Enough for 2 days' ride to Silver Creek. He was all business, his voice crisp and practical, detailing the logistics of her survival. But what about Finch? Alara asked, her voice trembling slightly. How do I get out of here without them seeing me? I'll create a diversion, he said, his face grim. Something big enough to pull Finch and all his men to the other end of town. A fire, maybe, or a brawl at the saloon that spills into the street. It'll be chaos. That will be your window. You'll have to move fast. Once you're clear of the town, don't stop. Ride until dawn. The plan was audacious, fraught with peril. So much could go wrong. But it was a plan. It was action, not passive waiting. It was a chance. She took the map, her fingers tracing the faint pencil lines that marked the treacherous path through the Badlands. It was a geography of hope. And you? She asked again, her gaze rising to meet his. What happens to you after I am gone? Finch will know you helped me. He will not let it go. A flicker of something, a weary resolve, perhaps, passed through his eyes. I'm the law in this town, until someone says otherwise. I'll handle Finch. My concern right now is you. He looked at her, his expression serious. You'll be alone out there. You'll have to be smart, and you'll have to be strong. There's no room for fear. I am afraid, she confessed in a whisper. I know, he said, his voice softening for the first time. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you go on anyway. He reached through the bars, his hand resting for a moment on her shoulder. The touch was brief, grounding. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of solidarity, a transfer of strength. You can do this, Alara. He had used her name. In all this time, he had never used her name. Hearing it from him now, spoken with such quiet conviction, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside her. He saw her not as a problem to be managed or a victim to be pitted, but as Alara, a person capable of surviving this. He stepped back and unlocked the cell door, swinging it open. The creak of the hinges was a sound of liberation and terror all at once. Her sanctuary was gone. The world was open to her again, with all its attendant dangers. When the commotion starts, you go, he said, his voice once again all business. Out the back window of the cell. It's a short drop. The old smithy is directly behind you, across the alley. Don't look back. Just ride. She stepped out of the cell, clutching the satchel and the map. She was wearing the clothes he had given her, practical and anonymous. She had the pistol tucked securely in the waistband of her trousers, the flannel shirt hiding its bulk. She was no longer a Lara Croft, the would-be bride. She was someone else now, someone harder, someone forged in fear and silence. She was ready. She nodded at him, a single, sharp affirmation. There was nothing more to say. All the gratitude, all the fear, all the respect she felt for this quiet, stoic man was communicated in that one look. He understood. He gave her a final, brief nod in return. A partnership born of desperation, had reached its final, critical stage. He turned and began to prepare, checking his own weapon, pulling on a heavy duster. She went to the back window of the cell and waited, her heart pounding a steady, resolute rhythm. She listened for the sounds of chaos, for the signal that her new life, or her death, was about to begin. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of clouds obscuring the stars. It was a perfect darkness for an escape. An hour passed in taut silence. Alara stood by the cell window, the cool night air drafting in, carrying the distant, discordant sound of a poorly played piano from the saloon. Every nerve in her body was on fire with anticipation. Silas stood by the front door, a shadow in the darkness, listening. He was a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Then it began. A sudden roar of voices from the direction of the saloon, followed by the distinct crash of breaking glass. It wasn't just a drunken shout. It was the sound of orchestrated violence. Another crash, then a splintering of wood. A single gunshot cracked through the night, sharp and definitive. Alara flinched, her hand instinctively going to the pistol at her waist. "Now," Silas said, his voice cutting through the rising dingo. He didn't look at her. He pulled on his hat, drew his revolver, and without a backward glance, he unbarred the door and stepped out into the night, a lone figure walking toward the chaos he had unleashed. He was drawing the fire, becoming the focal point of the town's attention, giving her the cover she needed. Her heart leaped in her throat. This was it. There was no more time for fear. She swung the satchel over her shoulder, shoved the map into her pocket, and pushed open the small window. The drop to the muddy alley below was only a few feet. She landed with a soft squelch, her ankle protesting with a dull ache, a reminder of her initial flight. The sound of the fight at the far end of the street were louder now. Shouts, more gunshots, a raw, chaotic symphony. She didn't hesitate. Keeping low, she ran across the alley to the skeletal remains of the old smithy. The building was little more than a collapsing roof and 3 walls, but inside, shrouded in darkness, was a horse. The mare, Shadow, shifted at her approach, her ears twitching, but she remained calm, a testament to Silas's training. Alara untied the reins, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. She whispered a soothing word, a sound she hoped would calm her own racing heart as much as the animal's. With a surge of effort, she pulled herself into the saddle. The leather was cool and solid beneath her, a reassuring presence. She gathered the reins, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. She guided the horse out of the ruined structure and into the alley, away from the main street. Her path to freedom was through the back ways and shadows of the town she had never truly seen. She urged the horse into a walk, then a quiet trot, the animal's hooves making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing footstep. The sounds of the diversion were already fading behind her as she reached the edge of the town, where the last of the ramshackle buildings gave way to the open, rugged darkness of the Badlands. She risked a single, fleeting glance back. At the far end of the street, she could see the flickering light of torches and lanterns. Figures were moving, silhouetted against the light. It was a scene of pure chaos, a maelstrom centered around the saloon. Silas was in the middle of that, buying her time with his own life. The weight of his sacrifice settled on her, heavy and profound. She could not let it be in vain. She turned her face forward, kicked the horse into a canter, and plunged into the night. The trail Silas had marked on the map was barely a trail at all. It was a treacherous, winding path that snaked through narrow canyons and over sharp-edged ridges. Shadow was sure-footed, picking her way through the darkness with an instinct Alara could only trust. The wind was a cold, sharp blade, and the only sound were the horse's labored breathing and the skittering of unseen creatures in the rocks. She rode for what felt like hours, pushing herself and the horse onward, fueled by a desperate, burning need to put distance between herself and that town. But she was not as alone as she thought. A sound, faint at first, began to detach itself from the murmur of the wind. The unmistakable rhythm of another horse, moving fast, closing the distance from behind. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. They had seen her. Or perhaps Finch had been smarter than they'd anticipated, holding one man back, just in case. She urged Shadow faster, but the terrain was too difficult for a true gallop. The sounds grew closer. She could hear the horse's grunts of effort, the jingle of its harness. Her pursuer was gaining. The canyon walls fell away, and she found herself in a small, circular clearing, a pocket of open ground surrounded by towering rock formations. A dead end. Panic seized her. She spun Shadow around, her eyes straining in the darkness. A figure on horseback emerged from the canyon pass, blocking her only exit. He was one of Finch's men, the one with the cruel, rat-like face she'd seen outside the saloon. "Well now," he sneered, his voice carrying easily in the enclosed space. "Looks like the little birds try to fly the coop. Mr. Finch is going to be real happy to see you." He started to dismount, a rope in his hand. Her mind screamed. The collar, the cage, the life of obedience. No, not again. Not after everything. Without allowing herself a moment to think, to be afraid, she acted. She pulled the Colt from her waistband. The motion was fluid, practiced. She raised it with both hands, just as her father had taught her, the barrel surprisingly steady. The man froze, one foot out of the stirrup. He saw the gun in her hands and laughed, a short, ugly bark of disbelief. "You gonna shoot me with that, little girl? You ain't got the stomach for it." He took a step toward her. "Stay back," she warned, her voice a low, ragged thing she didn't recognize as her own. He took another step, his confidence absolute. "Give me the gun before you hurt yourself." He lunged for her horse's reins. In that instant, the world narrowed to the front sight of the pistol, the dark shape of his body, and the cold, hard certainty that rose up from the deepest part of her soul. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, the flash of fire a brief, violent star in the darkness. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but she held on. The man cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise, and staggered backward, clutching his leg where the bullet had hit him. He fell to the ground, cursing, his confidence shattered. She had not aimed to kill. She had aimed to stop him, and she had. He was incapacitated, his threat neutralized. She looked down at him, writhing on the ground, and then at the smoking pistol in her hand. She felt no triumph, no remorse. Only a grim, chilling sense of finality. She was not the same woman who had fled in a torn wedding dress. That woman was gone, washed away by the storm, burned away by fear, and now, finally, buried here in this dark, lonely place. She did not wait. She yanked Shadow's reins, turning the horse and pushing past the wounded man, back into the canyon. She did not look back. She rode into the darkness, the echo of the gunshot her declaration of independence. Dawn broke over the edge of the Badlands, a fragile line of pale gold that slowly, inexorably, pushed back the darkness. The air was cold and clean, and the sky above was a vast, clear canvas of deepening blue. Alara had ridden through the night, the single gunshot echoing in her memory, a final, percussive end to her old life. She had followed the map, trusted the horse, and pushed her own body to the limits of its endurance. Now, she had reached the edge of the desolate country. Before her, the land softened into rolling, grass-covered hills. It was a landscape of possibility. She was no longer running from something. She was riding toward something. She didn't know what it was, only that the choice would be hers. She dismounted, her body aching with a profound weariness, and led Shadow to a small creek to drink. As the horse drank, Alara knelt and splashed the icy water on her face. She looked at her reflection in the clear, moving water. The face that looked back was a stranger's. It was thinner, etched with lines of exhaustion and strain, but the eyes were different. The fear was gone, replaced by a hard-won clarity. This was the face of a woman who had survived. A sound made her look up, her hand instantly going to the pistol still tucked in her waistband. A lone rider, was approaching from the direction she had come, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was another of Finch's men, but the rider's silhouette was familiar. Broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with an easy, solid grace. It was Silas. He rode up to her and dismounted, his face grim in the early morning light. There was a fresh cut on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were bruised, but he was otherwise unharmed. He looked from her to her horse, his gaze taking in her exhausted but resolute state. "Finch is gone," he said, his voice rough. "He and his men left on the morning stage. The man you shot will live. He'll have a limp to remember you by." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. It was over, truly over. "And you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What happened?" "The diversion worked," he said with a slight, grim smile. "Finch thought I was a bigger threat than you were." He was wrong. He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers. "When he found out you were gone and that his man had been shot, he decided the price of getting you back was too high. Men like him are cowards at heart. They only fight battles they know they can win." They stood in silence for a moment, the rising sun warming their faces. The vast, open country stretched before them, a promise of a future unwritten. He had come after her, not as a pursuer, but to see her safe, to close the final chapter of their shared ordeal. Through her exhaustion, a thought began to form, a profound and simple truth. Her survival had not been a matter of being rescued. Silas had not been her savior. He had been something far more important. He had been a bulwark, a wall against which she could brace herself while she found the strength to stand on her own. He had given her a sanctuary, armed her, and then opened the door and trusted her to walk through it. He had honored her struggle by letting it be her own. "The train station is a half-day's ride north of here," he said, breaking the silence. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. "There's enough here for a ticket, to wherever you want to go, a place where the name Finch means nothing." He held out to her. It was a path to a new life, a clean break and escape. It was everything she had thought she wanted. She looked at the pouch in his hand, then at the endless expanse of the horizon, and then, finally, at him. At this quiet, steady man who had stood against a storm for her, who had seen her not as a broken thing, but as a person worthy of a fighting chance. Leaving felt like running again, and she was done running. "Is there work to be found in this territory?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "Honest work? I can cook and sew. I'm a quick learner." He looked surprised, a rare crack in his stoic facade. He had expected her to take the money and disappear, to put this whole ugly chapter of her life behind her. "There's always need for a good hand," he said slowly, lowering the pouch. "It's a hard life out here." "I'm not afraid of hard," she replied. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed his harsh features, revealing a warmth she had only suspected was there. "No," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "I suppose you're not." He did not press her. He did not ask why. He simply accepted her choice, as he had accepted everything else about her, with a quiet, unwavering grace. The future was still a vast, unknown territory, as untamed and unpredictable as the land around them. There would be other struggles, other hardships. But as she stood there, in the clean light of a new day, with this unlikely ally beside her, she felt not fear, but a profound and liberating sense of peace. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, it was hers to choose. And that was enough.